we shared the link to the slides, you can have it and access it after the talk. Okay, we can now move on to the next part.
So I know we've spent a lot of time not talking directly about Django, but it was really important for us to establish some basics because we're going to see everything we've discussed so far over and over again now in Django. And so hopefully it will be a little less daunting when we hear a lot of these terms that Django's using. And so we're going to build a Django application from the ground up. And so these are the basic steps. We're not going to run through them so we can save some time, but you all should have access to the presentation for this breakdown. And so before we get started, just one more time about MVC. When we talk a little, then the language that Django uses is slightly different. In a language like Ruby on Rails, for example, there's actually a specific layer for controllers and then views and models. Django uses slightly different language where the model is still a model and talks to the database, but the view and kind of controller logic lives in what they call views. And then what we typically think of a view for MVC framework is called a template or Django template. So we'll see this language come back up, but this gives you kind of an idea. This is what Django is really doing. And then this is what it's sending to the client. And then this is the database that's outside of the framework. And so we can get started with bootstrapping a Django project. We already know how to use pip, so we can do pip install Django. And then once you install pip, it will give you another new command that you can run called django-admin. And you do django-admin start project web app. And then this is all assuming we're in a terminal that gives us the bash command. We can go directly into that directory with cd. And right out of the box, this is kind of what we were talking about that question about Flask versus Django. Flask doesn't offer the ability to generate a application scaffolding. So we could see just by running that one command, we already have some code. We didn't even have to write anything. It gives us something called manage.py, which is a really powerful command and program that we're going to use over and over again as we build on top of this framework. And then it gives us some scaffolding for the application, including a settings file and some other things we can look at here. Again, I'm not going to read through here, but this will give you a breakdown of the purpose of each one of these folders and files. But the main ones I want to point out, the settings file is really key. It really defines the entire schema for the application. URLs. So we already talked about URLs, and URLs is this file basically is a table of contents of all the different pages that your application will render. And then you'll see these two other files. I'm not going to go into these particularly, but they're referred to for ways to actually deploy an application. We'll come back to them a little bit at the end of the presentation. And so once you've installed Django, you should be able to do Python manage run server. And so again, we're using the manage command, and then it has a parameter called run server. And when we do this, it will start up a version of your application locally. It's also giving us a command about migrations. We'll talk about that in a second. But what's important for now is you'll see that it's saying that my development server is running on port 8000. We didn't really talk about ports. That's kind of a TCP/IP thing, but it just for simplicity, basically is a location on your computer that your server can take up and render your application. And so if we open the browser now, we can see that my local host, which is an alias for that IP address that we saw in the previous example, and then you can see it's appended by a port that we were looking at. And then when you first start the application, Django has like a web page for you that just says, "Yay, we did it, we started." And you can see that in this basic web page, it tells you go to the Django docs. Definitely follow the tutorial on the polling app, because we'll go through a lot of the stuff that we go through. And then there's also the community. So we've achieved our goal of starting our first Django app locally. And so before we move forward, I've been using app and project kind of interchangeable, but Django does make a distinction. So what we started at, we've started so far as a Django project, and individual functionality will be encapsulated by what we call an app. And so we've started a Django project, but we haven't implemented the app piece. And so the app is generated again by manage.py. And so in this case, we're going to make a very simple flashcard app that has the most basic functionality that will highlight what we can do with Django. And so we do something like Python manage start app, and then flashcards will be the name of our app. And that Django will generate a whole list of files again. And we can see a couple things that are going to be critical. One of the things is models. So we're talking about models and views. So these terms should, and file names should kind of make sense. There's also a test file that we'll talk about. And then migrations, which we'll cover in 1 second. And then a couple other files that include configuration for administration and configuration. And so here's an example of the views file for our flashcards app. And this should kind of look similar to the Flask example that we saw before, except now we're importing something from Django. In this sense, this example, object called HTTP response. And then similarly to the Flask example, we can define a function. And because of the way Django is set up, we don't even need any kind of decorator. We can just define a function, and Django will know what to do, and it will actually inject request. And later on, we'll actually use this object. But for now, this request object is actually a Python representation of an HTTP GET response. And what we're doing here is we're responding back to the server with just very simple, or to the client with a very simple string, and it will default to an HTTP response code of 200. And what we'll need to do is we need to tell the URLs file that we've defined this new index function. And in this case, it's going to be the root path, the main entry point to our app. And then finally, we need to also tell, so this was at the flashcards level URLs. This is at the top level, and we're basically saying that we should have a route that responds to flashcards. And then we'll worry about the admin one later. And then finally, this is what you get. So here we can see that I'm still rendering the same localhost 8000, and now I have a new page. And then this is the output of that little route that we had defined, just the string there. And so that's a pretty simple example, but we can start moving forward now that we have the idea. So before we can start talking to the database, we need to tell in the settings.py, there'll be a section called installed apps. We talked about what an app is. We need to also add our new app called flashcards, and that will enable us to start working with the database. And so in the flashcard models file, again, we're going to do this very similar thing that we saw in the Flask example. In this case, we're going to use Django DB. This is part of the Django object relational mapper. We're going to define a new model and database table called flashcards. And then we're going to say that it has a title, question text, and we're setting different data types. So text field, integer field, date time. These are all data types for the database model. And then once we've defined that, all we need to do is call Python manage make migrations flashcard, and it will generate a new Python file that's basically a Python representation of the database definition. We're not going to look at that file. This is all auto-generated, but all you need to know is that that's what actually is going to set up the database to understand what this modeling looks like. And then finally, when we do Python manage migrate, it will do the process of configuring a database. So at the end, once these are all run, if I spit out the whatever SQL database I'm using, a MySQL or Postgres, it will have a flashcards table with the columns that we defined. But we never need to write SQL. And if we make a change to the database, all we have to do is create a new migration and then do Python manage migrate again, and it will continually update it. And so we don't have to write any SQL to set up our database for manipulation. And so here's an example of actually putting this in practice. I'm going to call another command, manage by shell, which opens an interactive prompt where I can write both Python and import various modules from our new app. And so here I'm importing my flashcard model. I'm also importing a time zone util. I'm creating a new instance of the flashcard object here. and then I'm calling save, and that will actually persist this flashcard in the database. Again, I never have to write any SQL, and then I'm exiting this screen. And then finally, we're going to update the index view so we can start manipulating it. Again, we're importing the flashcard model. Now I'm using the object relational mapper to get all the flashcards. I'm building an object that we can kind of inject in the HTML. And then here we're using another similar to the Django render template method. This is just called render. We also pass the request in. We say which template we're going to use, and then we pass the context in. And then here's the Django language template, actually using that, very similar to the example before. We saw flashcard and flashcards, and then we render a table with the flashcard text and the answer text. And then finally, this is what we get, very, very ugly website. But we can see now that the database model that we had defined and had initialized and created an instance is being rendered on our new flashcards page. And so far we've only talked about get request, kind of simply rendering, but what if, like, how does it work to add functionality like creating a flashcard? And so in order to achieve that, we need to add some type of form to the HTML template. And so here we can use some helpers to map to a new create function that we're adding. And that we're going to say that this is a post request, HTTP post request. And then, we aren't really going to talk a lot in this presentation about web security. It's kind of an advanced topic, but I included this because I wanted to point out that Django will give certain things like this. The CSRF token is used to identify that a request is coming from a known source, usually on the same server as Django. So what that means is if I defined a form like this and tried to post a request to the server and it didn't have the CSRF token injected, it would be rejected by Django because it doesn't recognize it. So this is an example of like a built-in Django security measure. And then we can see I'm defining a couple inputs that have names that correspond to the database model columns, and then a button to submit it. And so we would need to add a new handler to our views. In this case, we're going to call it create. And we can see here, we keep on coming back to the HTTP methods that we talked about earlier, where I'm checking that the data is coming from this post. I'm again creating a new instance of this flashcard, but now I'm passing in the data that was sent from the form. I'm also manipulating to create a title from the text, and then adding the flashcard time zone. I'm saving that model. And in this case, I'm using another Django helper method called redirect, where after I've saved it for this purpose of this application, we're just going to go back to the index page to see the updated data. And so the final example is here. I'm filling out our form. I click the flashcard button. I can see before then I only have these two. And then if I press, the page will refresh and take me to here. And now I can see my new database model. So we can see the full life cycle of what we just defined, of creating a form, submitting the form, writing some database to the data, writing new data to the database, and then rendering that new data that's been updated. And so that's kind of the full cycle of using a post request. And so the final thing, that's kind of the high level of what you get with Django. There's so much more when it comes to the different functionalities, when it comes to both administration and modeling multiple relationships between models, which are more advanced topics. But before we kind of wrap up talking about the basics of Django and really how do you take something like this and put it into a place where it's accessible to everybody, not just your local machine, I want to talk a little bit about automated testing, which is a core concept from software engineering. And Django offers a built-in testing framework. And so what automated tests allow us to do is once we've created some functionality, we can write some code that actually runs that functionality through its paces and make sure that it's doing what we expect. This really helps both to make the code less buggy when you first implement it. And as your code base grows, you want to make sure that you don't break some existing functionality by making a code change. And so this basic example we just had, I'm here, I have a test where I'm I'm creating an existing object in the database, and then I'm making my GET request. And Django offers a utility to allow you to actually make a request. And I'm requesting the flashcards page. And then I'm making what are called assertions, or kind of checks that both the response is responding with a 200, which means it's okay. And then in this case, I'm making an assertion that the response actually includes one of the data points that we expect as a column in the HTML. And so that means if I made some change that would prevent this from actually returning 200 or returning with this text, like even if I change the template from a TD to a paragraph tag, it would fail this test, and I would know that something went wrong. And then one more example is testing our create functionality. So similarly, I'm creating some example data. I'm asserting first that there's no database, no flashcards in our test database. I make a post request, and you can see here I'm passing in the data along with the URL or the path for the request. And then in this case, the status code should be 302, which means that it created the object. And now I'm asserting that one object lives in the database, and that object has the title, which is in the previous example of this route, I showed taking the question text, lowercasing it, and joining it with a hyphen. So I'm actually testing that functionality. Django also allows you to test individual models and view controllers. But I thought this example would kind of highlight both the full life cycle of the application that we just built, and how to test it. And so when you write these tests, it would look something like this. Again, manage.py test, and it will actually run our test. And in this case, our application is good to go. If they failed, it would tell us what the failure is, and what potentially we need to do to fix it. Finally, when we're playing around locally, you probably will want to take a look at the admin panel. And so Django automatically has an administration system that comes out of the box. This is one of the really big benefits of Django, because most applications, you want some way to manipulate the database or investigate the database without being a developer and actually going into the server and looking at the code. And so here, manage.py, we're going to create a super user, which will give us admin access. You'll enter your details. And finally, we're also going to register in the admin.py file an additional model. So basically, this is saying is the admin site should also create a view for flashcards. And what this looks like is in practice is localhost. I can log in. I see a Django administration panel. I see groups, users, and I can see my flashcard models. If I click on flashcards, it will give me a list of flashcards. And if I click into the flashcard, it actually gives me a whole ability to, from the admin panel, edit that object. And so if I don't need to implement this on the client side, I actually have this administration panel that comes out of the box with Django. And so that is the very, very high level overview of Django in kind of the core concepts. There's a lot more to learn, a lot of advanced concepts, but that should give you the foundation of being able to spin up an application locally, render some templates, model some databases, write some tests. And once you get to that point, you should be able to kind of start digging into some of the advanced concepts. And so the final section is going to be talking about deploying projects. But before we go there, I do want to stop one more time to ask if there's any questions about what we just covered for Django.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So there's a comment that says this is the best Data Umbrella webinar so far. So kudos to you. There's a question, a follow-up question after you had answered the Flask versus Django. Naveen is asking, in a production scenario, should we use Django?
Versus Flask or any other one?
Yeah, versus Flask, yeah.
It really, for being a good software engineer, you want to choose the right tool and framework for the project that you're working on. And so Django is very versatile. It can be used in a ton of different applications, and it does come with a lot of stuff out of the box that Flask and other smaller frameworks don't come with. However, it depends on the use case of the given scenario. Sometimes Django can be overkill, and so there's plenty of production applications that are just using Flask, usually just as an API, where all it's doing is getting data from a database and returning JSON, or it's serving as some kind of application gateway where you make a request and it kicks off some background jobs, and you don't need the whole kind of scaffolding for Django. So Flask is perfectly fine for production applications. It does require a little bit more knowledge of web development, where if you wanted to kind of start your own web app, Django probably is going to be a little bit easier to go. But both are perfectly, suited for a production environment.
Yeah, that's the only question so far.
Great.
If folks still have questions, continue posting them on the Q&A section as the webinar progresses, so we can continue.
Great. All right, so we've covered kind of Django locally, learning the core concepts. So we're going to quickly go into deploying Django projects. Before I go further, just want to kind of put it out there that this is kind of the realm of DevOps, system administration. Usually in production environments, there's teams that are working on deploying these projects. If you're working on a smaller project, you can definitely handle this part of the application, but it does require a decent amount of prerequisite knowledge if you're trying to build something that's very scalable, and you want something at a very high level of reliability and scalability. We're going to use a very basic example to give you a taste of what would go into deploying a Django project, but this is a advanced topic that has a lot of area for additional learning. So with that said, your main two options when you're talking about deploying Django applications are either going to be using an infrastructure as a service provider or a platform as a service provider. And so what an IaaS is it provides very high level APIs for cloud computing primitives, which means if you're using something, I'm sure a lot of you hear Amazon Web Services as a popular platform or infrastructure as a service. And what a platform like that will allow you to do is spin up individual servers, individual databases, and set up network communication between them, all mainly through point and click services, or there will be configuration type of formats that you define some of the infrastructure in a JSON or XML like format, and then the service will set up your infrastructure in that way. And then you have platform as a service, which is even a higher level abstraction on top of infrastructure as a service, where you don't even really have to think about the servers and database setup as much. It's more oriented towards rapid development, where infrastructure as a service, having a background in DevOps or system administration is going to be really helpful. Platform as a service is kind of designed to make it easier for developers to get something out, into the wild without necessarily being a pro at DevOps. And for our example, we are going to choose a platform as a service because it does give us some really simple interfaces to get something off the ground. And just, technologies are used for these various purposes. You probably have seen a lot of these. So Google Cloud Platform, they have their own app engine, which is actually more of a platform as a service. Kubernetes is a whole different system that allows you to run individual kind of containerized instances of your application that's really scalable. Compute Engine is a way for you to run individual kind of serverless functions where you don't even have a server running. It's just a virtual machine. AWS has similar things. You hear EC2, they also have Kubernetes. And then DigitalOcean is more of a platform as a service, and Heroku are platform as a service. But DigitalOcean also offers, individual virtual machines as well as databases. And so most of these services have a lot of overlap and different functionality, and it depends on your use case and what you're looking to do. And so in our case, we're going to use DigitalOcean, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's a lot of configuration to go. So I'm not covering all the configuration, but I'm just going to cover database configuration because it's a really good example of what we're talking about. So in our example before, we might have had something like this in our settings file for a database, and maybe I was just using SQLite 3, and it defines the type of database I'm using and the path to our database. In a production environment, we're probably going to look at something more like this. So maybe I want to use PostgreSQL. It's a type of relational database. I'm defining the engine, which is basically what service or what code we're going to use, object relational mapper, and then the name of the database, the user, password, host, and port. All of these are going to be needed. And you can see they're all getting them from environment variables, which means that there's going to be some environment that's going to have these defined, and that's going to be our platform as a service provider. And so in order to get this out in the world, we're probably going to want to host our code somewhere. And so here's an example of a project we're working on right now for Data Umbrella that is a Django based application that's hosted on GitHub. And so what this would look like in practice from the command line is our little application we had before. We might want to initialize a Git repository. Once we've created a repository remotely, we would push it up and have our code remotely hosted. And by remotely hosting it on GitHub, in the case of DigitalOcean, it simplifies a ton of the process. So a DevOps engineer in a infrastructure and service environment might need to set up how to get that code actually on the server and how we are going to configure that code for deployment. DigitalOcean actually sets a lot of the stuff up for us. And so once we kind of select our GitHub application, it actually auto detects the type of service that we're working for. So you can see it says, oh, it's a web service, it's Python. It also will auto-generate a build command. And in this case, it's actually going to call what I was mentioned before, one of those files that were auto-generated. And so this is basically a definition of how to start up the server in a production environment. And you also are setting your port for the application. And so that kind of handles that for you. And we're going to set up a database. So in this case, we can just select the database type from DigitalOcean, and we'll walk you through the size of the database and the type that you want to add. Once you do that, you'll set up those environment variables. So some of them, like the database URL, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are environment variables that will be accessible the way that I had showed before to be able to configure your application for deployment. And then finally, once the application has deployed for the first time, so once you've done that configuration in DigitalOcean, it will kick off a whole process of building. And you'll also need to hop into the console and do what we had done before locally. The first time you need to make the database migrations and migrate it. And then we will actually be setting up our production database in order to be used for the application. And then we can see here, this is kind of the final deployed application for the first time. You can see the event board and the database is running, and we have a couple other options here. And then we can also see the build logs for the application and how DigitalOcean is actually turning all those environment variables and code into something that's going to run. We can also see the runtime logs. So here we can see our GET request, HTTP. In this case, this is actually a request for a JSON endpoint. And so when the application is being used, you can actually look at the runtime logs and see what type of request your server is responding to. And then finally, in this case, DigitalOcean has created a domain for us, but you can use a custom domain, which we won't cover in this application. And this is just a kind of basic example of the administration panel. So in the case of this application, we don't have any HTML. It only serves up JSON. But we can see here in practice, this is the administration panel. And so that's kind of the full life cycle of a project being deployed with DigitalOcean. Like I said, there's so many different ways to deploy these applications. and it's kind of its own topic. But that's the gist of what you're going to really need to do to configure the application, inject those environment variables so it can connect to these various other services like hosted databases and networks. And so finally, I'm going to do a recap, and then we can kind of answer questions at the end. And so just to review what we've learned here, Django is a server-side web development framework. It provides a lot of abstractions working with TCP/IP. It implements a type of MVC design framework patterns. It uses an ORM to work with databases. It has template engines that we can dynamically inject data into HTML. It can serve up HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We can use automated tests to build more reliable software and avoid regressions or bugs introduced with new changes. There's a variety of ways to deploy Django projects. You can use Git for both collaborating and deploying. And deploying Django projects will require you to most likely use some type of infrastructure as a service or platform as a service to set up the environmental variables, databases, and connect to external services. And that's kind of a high level of all the things that we've captured here. And hopefully these will be a jumping off point for learning more. Here's a couple example sites, including the Django docs, Full Stack Python, DigitalOcean, which has a really good overview of how to deploy a Django app, which I derive some of this my own learnings from. Mozilla is a big Django company, and they have great docs about Django, as well as Django Girls also offers some really good documentation as well. And so other things to point out, Django conferences that are coming up, there's a whole vibrant community around Django. So definitely check those out and get involved. And then finally, if you are interested in learning more about Django and web development, and also working for initiatives working in sustainability and social impact, definitely check out Sustainable Progress and Equality Collective. I'm a co-founder there, and we offer a lot of training, mentorship, paid and unpaid service learning opportunities where you can work with technologies like Django and some of these other frameworks that we've talked about today, while contributing to real-world projects for SPEC as well as aligned organizations. You can find us at docs.sbcollective.org. You can email us at info@sbcollective.org. And if you are interested in donating, you can donate on Open Collective. And so with that, I think we can go to final questions and answering any lingering things that might have come up.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for the presentation. If there's any last questions you have, you can post them on the Q&A. Because the previous ones have all been answered, there are some good comments here. Thank you, Joe, for the utmost Django content delivery. There was also a suggestion by Alex for beginners. pythonanywhere.com is also a good place to deploy your code on, and it's free. Cooper also said it's a very clear and understandable presentation. Thank you, Data Umbrella. There's a question. Rosa Maria asks kind of a bit of this out of the scope of this talk. As a data-oriented person, I like to make plots from my database. How do you add plots? Or maybe a bokeh server to a Django project? I really don't know where to start. I need some clue or link to guide me.
So to answer the question about adding data plots to your Django application, there's a couple different approaches. You can just render an image and then just host that on Django, and it can serve it up if it's just a static image. If you're trying to do like interactive data visualizations, and you probably need some type of JavaScript integration. Like D3 is a library that allows you to take data and then dynamically render it onto your page. So there's a couple different ways to get that data visible through your Django application. And what was the second question?
The second question was just how do you add plots or maybe a bokeh server to a Django project? And if there are any links to guide her on where to get started.
Yeah, so you all should have access to the presentation and the next steps slide. There are quite a few links there about learning more about Django, which should be an entry point to answer some of those questions.
Yeah, I think that is the only question we have. Is there anyone with another question? The rest are comments. Thank you. Awesome talk. Getting ready to start knowing Django. Thank you for getting me started with Django. Great presentation. So people have really loved your presentation. Reshma has also reshared the slides one more time. If you want to go through them or have them for reference, you can get the link from the chat. This video has also been recorded, so we'll have it posted on our Data Umbrella YouTube page for anyone who wants to go back and get some more information or while you are building a project. There's a question, what's the full web application cycle?
That's a that's a big question. Full application lifecycle. I don't know if I can capture that in a single sentence. I would say that what we're talking about with the client server model and everything that goes in there, right? From the client making a request from the browser, going through all the TCP/IP kind of plumbing and pipeline, the server talking to the database or other external services, responding. All the way back to the browser, where the browser takes that response from the server, interprets it, and actually renders it to the final user, kind of encapsulates the entire life cycle of a web application at a high level.
Okay, Margaret asks, in your experience, which front-end frameworks and which SQL databases work well with Django?
What's really great about Django for the backend in talking with databases and in general object relational mapping is that it can talk to a variety of databases without really having to know anything about them. And so PostgreSQL or Postgres is a very popular open source database. MySQL is kind of a tried and true standard. But there are all kinds of other databases, as well as not just SQL databases, but there are Python libraries to talk with things like Elasticsearch, which is search engine, or NoSQL databases like MongoDB, or Redis, which is used a lot for caching and background jobs. And so there's a lot of different databases out there. Depends on the use case that you're working for, but Django can really talk with all of them. And then as for front-end frameworks, this is a very hot topic. There's always new JavaScript frameworks and CSS frameworks. I had mentioned a couple of the ones that are really popular right now: React, Vue.js, Angular. I am currently using a lot of React for projects where I'm talking to Django backends, but it really again depends on the use case and what you're trying to build.
Yeah, that was the last question. So we'll just stay for like 1 minute. In case you have a last minute question, just ask. Thank you for staying with us. Yeah, it's now around 8:37 East African time, which is great. 1.5 hours since we started. So thank you for joining us. Any last questions? Feel free to ask. We're still here for a few more minutes. Just to release the folks who want to go somewhere else. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your wonderful comments. I'll just add one more time that this video is available. Check out our YouTube page as that we are on YouTube as Data Umbrella. We'll have this video in the next 24 hours. If you want to go through it again, the slides are also being shared. We have also called for people who want to help with making the timestamps. Feel free to visit our GitHub page as that umbrella and pick an issue and work on it. Otherwise, it's been a great session. Yeah, Joe, you can go on.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the great questions. I wish you all luck as you dig into Django more and learn more about web development. And hopefully this presentation has been helpful, and definitely use the slideshow as a reference moving forward. And feel free to reach out if anybody is interested in learning more about web development and Django.